Charlie Kirk used to sell himself to kids by saying he's secular, but now he's a radical right-wing Christian. The reason for this change is grosser than you'd think. I'm Amanda Marcotte. Welcome to Standing Room Only. Charlie Kirk initially made his name as the most obnoxious of the Debate Me bros. Granted, that's a little bit like winning most stinky at the litter box Olympics. I've been getting texted kitten pictures all day. But Republicans do love men who are the worst, so it made him an overnight MAGA media star. In 2016, he started Turning Point USA as outreach to young college kids. And initially, he wanted his brand to be young and hip. He even said he had a secular worldview.
Christian conservatives fell for a trap that they really should have rejected, which is we might hold these truths very near and dear to our heart, theologically and biblically and spiritually and religiously. But I think where the line was crossed is in the 60s and 70s and 80s, where we tried to impose those beliefs through government policy. It's the imposition of those values through legislation and government, which is something I don't necessarily support, right? Yeah. So I try to always advocate for every one of my political positions through a secular worldview.
Turning Point USA cited their values as fiscal responsibility, free markets, and limited government. And Kirk even forbade his members from talking about abortion or same-sex marriage. More recently, however, Kirk and Turning Point USA have undergone a dramatic Christian right makeover. Now he is a full-blown theocrat who wants to force fundamentalist Christianity on the rest of us.
Again, there is no separation of church and state. It's a fabrication. It's a fiction. It's not in the Constitution. It's made up by secular humanists. It's derived from a single letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to the Danbury Baptist Convention. Of course, we should have church and state mixed together.
We could both go back and forth of like independent, trivial facts when it comes to the woman's reproductive system. But here's something we all know, because God wrote this on the human heart of every individual, as it says in the book of Romans. We know deep down it's wrong to murder a baby.
You're not murdering a baby.
Can you point to me a great power that endorsed same-sex marriage? Not cohabitation, but marriage.
Ancient Mesopotamia.
As marriage. As recognized.
As marriage that exists.
Recognized by the state.
100%.
And how did that work out for them?
It worked out perfectly fine. It was an accepted norm of society.
Okay, I still think it's wrong.
Look, it wasn't just one letter from Thomas Jefferson. The concept of a wall of separation between church and state goes back a century before that, and all of the founders spoke about it, often quite frequently. I'll be speaking about that more during Pass the Mic with my guest, Randall Balmer. Kirk has gone all in with this youth minister shtick. He even believes in the Seven Mountains Mandate, which calls on far-right Christians to control all of government, media, business, and education. It was a belief held by a lot of the January 6 rioters, which was why they were waving around those Appeal to Heaven flags. Those are a symbol of total Christian domination. Kirk knows where his bread is buttered. Religious fanaticism is central to Donald Trump's base. I mean, again, look at all those January 6 fools waving crosses and praying. And while the religious right has steered Republicans for decades, things got way worse under Joe Biden's presidency. Right-wing media churned out increasingly radical content denouncing LGBT equality and women's rights. By starting Turning Point Faith in 2021, Kirk was hopping on this whole trad trend.
I'm Addie, and I'm 14. I'm a freshman in high school.
I think there is an argument to bring back the MRS degree. And no, seriously. And just be clear, that's why you're going to college, right? Don't lie to yourself, I'm studying sociology. No, you're not. We know why you're here. And that's okay. I say college is a scam, but if you're going to find your life partner, that's actually a really good reason to go to college. And so, yeah, you could go learn some stuff. That's fine, I guess, or whatever. Just don't listen to your professors.
The look on that girl's face is so great. I'm 14. Why are we talking about me getting married? But another reason is deeply rooted in the history of white evangelicalism: racism. Now, Kirk's racism goes back way to the beginning of Turning Point USA, when they were having affirmative action bake sales on college campuses.
Racists go home! Racists go home! People are really aggressive about us, about it's calling us racist, taking our posters, taking away our baked goods.
But what other students had a problem with is this. Prices based on race and gender, with Asians paying the most and Native Americans getting the goods for free.
But now it's gotten even worse. Kirk recently hosted white supremacist Steve Saylor on his show. They even hyped Charles Murray, who has a long career of arguing that black people are inherently less intelligent than white people. He's also been tweeting stuff like, whiteness is great, and we should thank white Europeans for abolishing slavery. Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass? Or the part where white Europeans invented chattel slavery? But again, Kirk is speaking to a very young audience. They may not know the history here.
The great replacement of white people is far more sinister than any redistricting project.
Once a week, we talk about why the Civil Rights Act was a mistake.
We know for certain that MLK, being a minister, was a womanizer and had multiple 40-plus affairs. I want to make sure that is mentioned. Now, that's not necessarily a disqualification, but it should make pause before we turn that into a national holiday.
I like that he was like, okay, I'm not saying 40 affairs is disqualifying because Trump. I wanted to be clear to the audience that many historians have debunked a lot of the stuff that Kirk says about MLK. And again, that gets back to the problem we're talking about. Like, he says this stuff with a lot of confidence, and his audience may not know that he's just straight up lying about a lot of this. Last month, Kirk devoted a chunk of his podcast to honoring influential evangelical pastor John MacArthur, who passed away on July 14th at the age of 86.
John MacArthur is without a doubt one of the most influential Protestant minds since the Reformation. He never bowed to the gods of this age. He never apologized for Scripture.
I mean, they say they honor him, but that photo is pretty brutal. One of MacArthur's most old-fashioned beliefs is that slavery is godly. In 2001, MacArthur delivered an infamous sermon at his California megachurch. He argued that black people are cursed by God to be servile people who are
doomed to perpetual slavery.
11 years later, he had not changed his mind.
It is a little strange that we have such an aversion to slavery because historically there have been abuses. You know, there have been abuses in marriage. We don't have an aversion to marriage particularly. Working for a gentle, caring, loving master was the best of all possible worlds. If you had the right master, everything was taken care of.
My guest for Pass the Mic is historian Randall Balmer. In 2011, he wrote an influential Politico article that argued that the religious right was formed for protecting segregated schools. Jerry Falwell formed the Moral Majority in the 1970s, and he was a very Charlie Kirk-like figure. He despised Martin Luther King and argued that civil rights activists were communists. In the 1950s, he gave a sermon denouncing Brown versus the Board of Education. All right, this is the stuff he was saying. If Chief Justice Warren and his associates had known God's word and had desired to do the Lord's will, I'm quite confident that I'm trying to do a Jerry Falwell. The facilities should be separate. When God has drawn a line of distinction, we should not attempt to cross that line. Do I have to say that? I am not saying that word. He uses an N-word, not that N-word, but the other N-word. Does not want integration. He realizes his potential is far better among his own race. For young people who don't know this history, it might be hard to understand why Christian nationalism is such a dangerous ideology. Republicans like to make it seem like it's no big deal ending the separation between church and state. They make it seem like it's just about prayer in school and the 10 Commandments on the wall. You know, stuff that's annoying to kids but may not seem like a serious threat to freedom. But hopefully I've shown you why we need the First Amendment. Religion is used to justify homophobia, misogyny, and I hope I've persuaded you, racism. When the government kowtows to religious authorities, they don't have to worry anymore about facts and reason. They can just say, God said so. Charlie Kirk knows his opinions don't actually make any sense, so he can just whip out the Bible and say we all have to live under his interpretation of it. And he's doing it all for an audience of young people who may not have the education or experience to see right through him. My guest today is Dartmouth historian Randall Balmer. He's got a new book out called America's Best Idea, The Separation of Church and State. Thank you so much for joining us on Standing Room Only, Randall.
My pleasure.
I want to start by asking you about something that Charlie Kirk said with great authority on his show, that separation of church and state is a fabrication and that it only was mentioned once by Thomas Jefferson in a letter. I would like to ask you, as someone who wrote a whole book about it, is that true, or what are the facts here?
Well, technically, I suppose it's true, but in a very, very narrow sense. And when we think about the First Amendment, which I think is America's best idea, I think it's important to consider what contemporaries thought they were doing when they formed the new nation and passed the First Amendment as part of the Bill of Rights. And I think we have two bits of evidence from that. First, we have the Treaty of Tripoli, which was negotiated at the end of George Washington's administration, sent to the Senate by John Adams with his fulsome endorsement, read aloud before the Senate, and unanimously ratified on June 7th, 1797. Article 11 of the Treaty of Tripoli reads in part, "As the government of the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion."
Yeah.
And then it goes on, but that's the relevant portion. "As the government of the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion." That's one bit of evidence. Second bit of evidence, and the one that Charlie Kirk is referring to, is a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to a group of Baptists in Danbury, Connecticut, who were quizzing him on his understanding of this relationship between church and state. And it's a very famous letter known as the Danbury Letter, which he drafted on New Year's Day, 1802, as President of the United States, responding to the Danbury Baptists. And in that letter he said, "I regard with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people that calls for the disestablishment of religion and freedom of religion." And then he goes on to say, "thus establishing a wall of separation between church and state." So that's where the phrase separation of church and state comes from. And so in that very, very, very narrow sense, Charlie Kirk arguably is correct. But especially for people who claim to be originalists in their interpretation of the Constitution, I think it's important to understand how the founders themselves understood that very remarkable phrase in the First Amendment.
And over again in their letters and their notes and everything, they made it very clear that they thought freedom of religion meant disestablishment.
Absolutely.
Like, that there was that the government just stayed out of it.
Exactly. And I think one of the crucial moments is when a proposal by Patrick Henry in Virginia to designate Christianity generally, that is to say, not simply Congregationalists or Baptists or Presbyterians or whatever you might choose, or Anglicans, but there was a proposal by Patrick Henry to in effect, establish Christianity as the state religion in Virginia. And that was turned back by James Madison in his famous document, Memorial and Remonstrance. And that paved the way for the Statute of Religious Freedom, which made it very clear there was no religious establishment in Virginia, and certainly then with the nation itself.
You mentioned that the letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote saying that there is a separation of church and state was to the Danbury Baptists, and I think this is another thing that people like Kirk just sort of slide over, sure. Right? Which is the Danbury Baptists wanted separation of church and state. They were asking him about it. Why was it so important to so many religious groups at the time that there be the separation of church and state?
Because there were minority groups, and this is one of the geniuses of the American government and our American society, is that our charter documents protect the rights of minorities, and this was a lesson that was learned through hard and difficult experience during the colonial period. When I teach my course on religion in North America, I ask my students to tell me what religious groups were colonizing the various colonies going on the Atlantic seaboard. And it's a remarkable diversity. You've got everything from Swedish Lutherans to French Protestants, also known as Huguenots. You have Jews in New York City after 1654. You've got Congregationalists in New England, Baptists,
Quakers,
Presbyterians, extraordinary diversity. So when the founders were beginning to think about how to configure this relationship between church and state, they were well aware of that. They were also well aware of the wars of religion back in Europe, well aware of the carnage that attended the English Revolution, and they wanted to avoid all that. Let's form a government that stays out of the religion business, and that was the genius of this. And it was a Baptist idea.
Yeah.
So it comes really, the whole metaphor, separation of church and state, comes from Roger Williams, who's the founder of the Baptist tradition in America. So this notion of church-state separation is part of the DNA of the whole Baptist tradition. But I think it's also important to recognize when Roger Williams talks about building a wall of separation between the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world, I think what we miss in the 21st century is a sense of who they were at that time. That is to say, I like to say that Roger Williams and his contemporaries were not members of the Sierra Club, which is to say they didn't share our romantic ideas about wilderness. Yeah. So for them, wilderness was a place of darkness where evil lurked. So when Roger Williams talks about separating the garden of the church from the wilderness of the world, he wants to protect the integrity of the faith. Yeah. From too close an association with the state. And I think that's an important lesson to remember.
And it's important for nowadays because we are seeing the religious right through the Trump administration tear down a lot of these parts of the wall between church and state. They're allowing proselytization at work. They want to put 10 Commandments up in classrooms. And then I think probably the one that gets to this issue, the heart, like how the church is getting corrupted, is the end of the Johnson Amendment, which forces churches to not have candidate endorsements from the pulpit if they want to keep their tax-exempt status. So they ended that. I think a lot of people in our audience are going to think, okay, well, that's bad for liberals and non-believers, but why is ending the Johnson Amendment bad for churches?
Yeah, well, I think it's bad in all sorts of ways, and I want to go back to one of your earlier points with the 10 Commandments. You know, these people are the Christian nationalists want to put the 10 Commandments. Why the 10 Commandments? I mean, if they're really talking about Christianity, I would go with the Sermon on the Mount. You know,
yeah, well, they definitely don't want that.
No. Or Matthew 25, what Jesus
for the non-believers, that's blessed are the poor, blessed are the meek. Sorry.
Exactly right. Or Matthew 25, when Jesus talks about treating the foreigner as one of your own, caring for the least of these, visiting prisoners and so forth, and caring for the needs of others. I mean, if they want to post something, that would be a better choice. But for the Johnson Amendment, I think it would be a terrible idea. First of all, we have to reckon with the fact that tax exempt, and this is something that they kind of leave out of the conversation. Let's reckon with the fact that tax exemption is a form of public subsidy. Yeah. So already, tax-exempt organizations are being subsidized by the public. The Johnson Amendment merely asks them in return for that public subsidy not to make political endorsements. Seems to me a reasonable request. Ever since 1954, most religious groups have thought, it's a pretty good deal, we'll take it. Yeah.
And now, public polls show most Americans believe in it.
Absolutely. And now we're talking about changing that. Well, let's think this through. If I'm allowed to make a tax-deductible contribution to a church, who will then endorse a candidate of my choosing? Well, it's a pretty good deal for me as a taxpayer, right? Because I get a tax exemption for that contribution. But doesn't that turn these churches or religious organizations into money laundering schemes?
Yeah.
It seems to me it does. And the ministers of these churches, the pastors, to the extent they have any shred of moral credibility left whatsoever, should stand up and say, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to function as a
And
as
a lot of
money
liberal
laundering
churches
scheme.
said that
Yes.
they're not going to do that. But a lot of conservative churches are like, all right, Elon Musk, write me my big old check, and in exchange I will say whatever you want.
You want me to say, right.
Yeah, and it's dangerous.
How is that a prophetic voice? It seems to me that people of faith have an obligation, especially in times like this, to offer a prophetic voice to the society, to the culture, because we're in dark times. I don't think there's any question about that. And if you're allowing your so-called prophetic voice to be purchased by the highest bidder, there's not much credibility behind it.
So we've talked a lot about why the separation of church and state is good for the church, because I think that a lot of people don't think about that aspect. But I do want to end this because I think for most of our viewers, their interest is going to be in protecting just democracy and the citizenry at large. So why do you think it's America's best idea?
Best idea because it protects both sides. And by the way, that was recognized again in the early years of the formation of this country. Thomas Jefferson in 1808, which was his last full year as president, said, "We have solved by fair experiment this experiment of separating church and state." And look, it works. Obviously, that's a paraphrase, but he was very clear about that. An Oxford University historian in the 1890s, don't quote me on that, but somewhere late in the 19th century, said, look what's happened in the United States. They've avoided all these religious contestations because they've avoided trying to unite church and state. So I think the genius of the First Amendment, the separation of church and state, is that it has shielded the state from the carnage of religious factionalism. But I think it has also created a vibrant and salubrious religious culture that is unmatched anywhere in the world.
Americans are very religious.
We are religious people. I mean, it's fallen off in recent years, and I think there are other reasons that explain that. But we're off the charts in terms of other Western nations. And I go back to Adam Smith. Adam Smith in 1776 published The Wealth of Nations, which is a classic brief for free market capitalism. And one of the examples he used in The Wealth of Nations, which is this huge tome, is religion. He said if the state stays out of the religion business, religion is going to flourish. And I think that's been the experience in American society. So what I find utterly confounding, and I'm just flummoxed by this, why is it that people of faith are now working to undermine the First Amendment, which is the best friend that religion has ever had? I honestly don't get it. I mean, it's myopic to say the least.
I mean, you could argue that one of the reasons we're seeing such a decline in religiosity in the United States is it actually coincides with the rise of conservative religious people getting into politics. It started in the 1970s when they started to get politically organized, and people were like, you know what, I don't want anything to do with this.
There's been a crass politicization of religion in this country, principally from the religious right. I mean, other groups are doing the same thing, but not on the same scale. And I think that has unquestionably led to a decline in religious adherence and the rise of the so-called nuns, N-O-N-E-S, in American society. So again, I think the First Amendment is key. And if you look at the history of this church-state relationship, which is what I do as a historian, it's worked remarkably well. And why would you want to change it? One of the quotes I have in the book is from Sandra Day O'Connor, and her last ruling on church-state matters before she retired from the Supreme Court. She said, in effect, again, I'm paraphrasing, those who want to blur the line of separation between church and state have to answer an important question. Why would we trade a system that has worked so well for us for one that has worked so badly for others? And I think that captures where we are in that whole question.
This has been great. So for our mic drop question, this has been a lot, but we'll have a little bit of fun. What is the one, okay, we have fully established that we do not think biblical law should be forced on people through the government. But if there was one, if there was one that you could force, especially on some of these politicians, what would it be?
Well, on the politicians, I'd probably go with the prohibition against bearing false witness.
Yes.
That would be the one I'd go with.
That's one of the 10 commandments they want to hang on the wall.
It's pretty clear, right? And we have the 45th president of the United States who, as you know, according to independent sources, made 30,573 false or misleading statements in his 4 years as president. I mean, that's a fire hose of deceit. I mean, it comes out to something like 22 a day. So I suppose that'd be one. But to be a little bit more lighthearted about it, I'd probably choose the Levitical proscription against wearing 2 different kinds of fabrics.
You only have to cotton, no polyester cotton.
That's right. So it would utterly revolutionize the fashion industry if we did that.
I love it. I love it. I will say, I kind of wish you could only enforce the 10 commandments on the politicians.
There we go. Yeah.
that want to hang them on the walls, because Donald Trump has violated, I think, all of them.
Certainly majority.
Anyway, thank you so much. Randall Balmer, he has a new book out. It's called America's Best Idea, The Separation of Church and State. Thank you so much for being on Standing Room Only, Randall.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And please, folks, don't forget to like and subscribe. It always helps us out. And don't forget to stick around for Encore. I have the song recommendation of the week for you. Hey, folks, mixing it up a little by coming to you from Philadelphia's own Reading Terminal Market. It is a former train station that they converted into a food mart, basically. It's of tons of vendors. It's kind of a wild space. I couldn't film inside, it's way too loud, but I'm here to buy some gifts for foodie friends. And also I want to do the song recommendation of the week, which is It's Not Right, But It's Okay by Whitney Houston. Now, yes, I usually do stuff that's a little bit more obscure than Whitney Houston. I really like this song as a mental health pick-me-up kind of song. It's technically about a woman finding out her partner's cheating, and the whole idea is it's not right, but she's gonna be okay. And I think that there's a lot of value in that message these days, to say to yourself, I don't like what's going on. I don't like the political situation we're in. I'm going to continue to fight against it, but in the meantime, I'm gonna be okay. I'm gonna find ways to take care of myself. So, Whitney Houston, she's a New Jersey girl. But that's close enough to Pennsylvania, right? If you really want to take the song to the next level, there's a kind of cheesy mix by Thunderpuss from 2007 that I often close house sets with, because I find it to be really fun and bombastic, and it really hits that high note that Whitney Houston is famous for. She has to do one in every song, right? The original from 1999 is great. The Thunderpuss remix from 2007 is great. It's Not Right, But It's Okay by Whitney Houston. If you want more Standing Room Only episodes, please hit the subscribe button on YouTube. Standing Room Only started as a newsletter, and it's free to read. Click the link to subscribe. I love tips. These political battles are playing out in our local communities, your family, your school, your neighborhood. If you have a story, go ahead and drop me a line, leave it in comments, and don't forget to subscribe.